The desert was merciless that afternoon, a furnace of gold and white stretching to every horizon. Ephraim Cutter rode alone, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much war and too many graves. His canteen was nearly dry when he spotted a small shape half buried in the sand. At first, he thought it was a coyote carcass. Then the wind shifted, revealing a braid of glossy black hair. He dismounted without a second thought. In his arms, the girl was light as smoke, her breath shallow but steady. Her face bore the fine beadwork of a tribe he knew well, and a conflict he'd spent years avoiding. Her name, he would later learn, was Tayanita. Barely more than a child, she wore a deerskin dress patterned with crimson diamonds, the handiwork of skilled hands from far beyond these barren flats. Ephraim shaded her with his coat, scanning the horizon. He knew this wasn't a chance encounter. In the West, nothing happened without reason, and rescuing a native child meant crossing a line drawn in blood generations ago, by the time he reached the trading post at Hollow Bend. Dusk had begun to bleed into the sky. Orville Gant, the old prospector who ran the place, took one look at the girl and stepped back as if Ephraim carried a stick of dynamite. "You don't know what you've done," Orville muttered, glancing toward the darkening east. "That's Chatan's bloodline. They'll come for her and for you." Ephraim didn't answer. He poured water into a tin cup and tilted it gently to Tayanita's lips. Her eyes opened just enough for him to see the fear behind them. Night fell heavy, the kind that made a man feel the weight of the entire desert pressing down. In the dim lamplight of the post, Ephraim thought of the last time he had stood between a child and a warpath. That time, the river ran red. He swore to himself it would be different now, though he had no idea how to make it so. The wind outside carried the faint rhythm of distant hoofbeats, a sound that crawled up his spine. By morning, the sound had grown into a steady thunder. Dust plumes rose on the horizon, swelling higher with every heartbeat. Orville's face was pale as milk. "They've come," he whispered, stepping away from the doorway as if it might burn him. Ephraim stepped outside, Tayanita cradled against his chest. Across the sunlit sand, 600 mounted warriors formed a wall of color and motion, their shields and lances glinting in the ruthless daylight. At their center sat Chatan himself, his gaze fixed on the man who had carried his daughter from the desert. The air between Ephraim Cutter and Chatan felt like a stretched rawhide rope, ready to snap. The warriors' horses pawed at the sand, their nostrils flaring. Ephraim stood rooted, Tayanita's small frame pressed close to him. He had faced rifles, cannons, and the chaos of battlefields, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the silent judgment of 600 riders. Not a single voice rose from their ranks, only the wind whispering over the desert floor. Chatan dismounted with a grace that came from years of leading men through war and famine. His dark hair was bound with eagle feathers, and his eyes held the weight of entire winters. He stopped 10 paces away, his gaze fixed on the girl. "Why?" The question carried across the sand without force, yet it struck like a hammer. Ephraim swallowed hard. "She was dying," he said simply. "I couldn't leave her." Chatan's face didn't change, but in the narrowing of his eyes, Ephraim saw the measure being taken and the sentence being weighed. Behind Chatan, a young warrior with restless hands, Makia leaned forward on his horse. "He stole her," Makia growled in their tongue. Ephraim didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. A wave of murmurs passed through the mounted warriors. Orville, standing just inside the post's doorway, looked like he wanted to melt into the shadows. Ephraim's jaw tightened. He had not stolen the girl, but he also knew that truth meant little when blood ties were at stake. Chatan took a step closer, his shadow falling across Ephraim's boots. "You are still alive because my daughter breathes," he said. But this is not over. You will ride with us, and you will answer before the council." The words carried no option, only certainty. Ephraim's mind raced. Going with them could mean never seeing the edge of civilization again, but refusing could mean an arrow before sundown. Tayanita stirred in his arms, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his coat. Her eyes flickered between her father and Ephraim, confusion clouding her expression. The moment was a blade's edge. Ephraim knew that if he handed her over now, he might walk away alive. But he also knew something was wrong. She did not look relieved to see her people. She looked afraid. Before he could speak, Makia barked an order, and 2 warriors swung down from their saddles. They began walking toward Ephraim, their spears angled low. The horses shifted, the air thickened, and somewhere deep in the line of riders, a war drum began to beat. The war drum's rhythm echoed in Ephraim's ribs as the 2 warriors closed in. He shifted his stance, careful not to look like a man, reaching for a gun, though the Colt on his hip felt heavier by the second. Chatan watched him with an unreadable expression, as if waiting to see whether this outsider would break or bend. Tayanita's small breaths warmed Ephraim's collarbone, each one reminding him that any wrong move might turn the desert into a killing ground. Makia's eyes burned with the sharp hunger of youth, the kind that seeks a reason to spill blood. "Give her to us," he demanded in accented English. His voice was loud enough for the entire war party to hear. The demand was not an invitation, it was a test. Ephraim's gaze drifted to Chatan, looking for a flicker of mercy, but the chief's face remained carved from stone. Slowly, Ephraim lowered Tayanita to the ground. She didn't run to her people. She didn't even look at them. She stayed close to his leg, fingers curling into his coat like roots clutching soil. A ripple passed through the warriors. Makia's lip curled. "She is afraid of you," he spat toward Chatan, though the words were meant to wound both men. Chatan's jaw twitched, but he didn't look at his daughter. Instead, he raised his hand, and the 2 warriors halted a step short of Ephraim. The drumbeat stopped. The desert fell into an unnatural silence, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. "You will come," Chatan said finally, voice low but absolute. "You will tell the council why my daughter fears her own blood, and you will tell them without lies." He turned and mounted his horse in one motion, a leader whose authority needed no show of force. Around him, the riders began to shift and wheel, a tide of muscle and leather and iron moving toward the distant mesas. Ephraim glanced back at Arvel, who stood frozen in the doorway of the trading post. The old prospector gave a small shake of his head, as if to say there was still time to walk away. But Ephraim knew better. Some lines, once crossed, were impossible to retreat from. He lifted Tayanita into the saddle before him, swung up, and nudged his horse into motion. The column of warriors swallowed them whole dot as the desert rolled past. The air grew thicker, heavier. Somewhere ahead lay the council, the truth about why this girl feared her own kin. And perhaps the last decision Ephraim Cutter would ever make as a free man. Before the elders could withdraw, a distant sound rolled across the desert hoofbeats. Not many, but fast. The kind that carried urgency. Every head turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight. The drumming hooves grew louder, and a rider burst into the circle, his horse lathered with sweat. He slid from the saddle, gasping words in Lakota too quick for Ephraim to follow. Whatever he said, it made Chatan's face go cold as winter stone. The rider's words struck the council like a thunderclap. Nokomis stiffened. Chatan's eyes narrowed, and the warriors around the fire bristled like wolves scenting danger. Though Ephraim couldn't understand the rapid Lakota, he caught the name Hollis more than once, and that was enough to knot his gut. Hollis was no friend to truth or to mercy. Chatan barked an order, and several warriors melted into the darkness, moving toward the camp's perimeter. Machia stepped close to the chief, his voice urgent, his eyes flicking toward Ephraim. Ephraim could read the body language easily enough. Machia wanted him gone, preferably tied to a post, or worse. But Chatan's hand went up, stopping him. Whatever the news was, Ephraim wasn't being dismissed, yet Nokomis turned toward him. "Men ride this way from the south," she said, her English crisp, deliberate. "Hollis leads them, not warriors' guns for hire. They come fast, and they come armed." The fire popped between them, a punctuation mark to the news. Ephraim's mind raced. If Hollis had taken Tayanita, as her fear suggested, then his arrival with armed men was no rescue mission. It was an attempt to erase the truth. Before it could take root, Tayanita single quotes, S hand found Ephraim's again. Her grip like iron. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything. She didn't want to go with Hollis, and she feared what would happen if he reached the camp. For the first time since they'd met, Ephraim saw something in her expression. Beyond fear, there was defiance there, a spark. Whatever had happened out in that desert, she didn't intend to vanish quietly into his shadow. Chatan looked to the elders. "We will not be hunted in our own land," he said. His voice had the weight of a verdict. Several warriors nodded, their hands already tightening straps, checking arrows, loading rifles. Mackey's grin was thin and sharp. He lived for moments like this. Ephraim, on the other hand, had lived through enough blood to know it never came. Without a price, the chief's gaze fell on Ephraim once more. "You ride with us," Chatan said. "You will see who speaks truth when the desert takes its payment." It wasn't a request. Around them, the camp came alive with the low thunder of preparation boots in the dust, rifles clicking, horses stamping. Somewhere beyond the firelight, the hoofbeats grew louder, and the scent of gunpowder seemed to ride in on the wind. The first glint of moonlight off metal gave them away. Hollis and his riders came into view just beyond the camp's perimeter, a dark knot of men moving fast, rifles strapped to their saddles. Their silhouettes swayed in the saddle like men who'd done this before, who knew exactly how to ride into trouble and make it stick. The camp's warriors fanned out, forming a wall between the intruders and the council fire. Abner Hollis reined in at 20 yards, his horse tossing its head, nostrils flaring. "Evening, Cutter," he called, his voice slick as lamp oil. "Seems you've got something that belongs to me." His eyes slid to Tayanita, who stood behind Ephraim, half shadowed by the firelight. "Why don't you hand her over before this gets messy?" Ephraim took a step forward, not lowering, his hand from the butt of his Colt. "She doesn't belong to you, Hollis." "She never did." His voice carried enough for the nearest warriors to hear, their stances tightening like bowstrings. Chatan stood silent beside him, but the set of his shoulders spoke volumes. He would not step aside. "Not tonight. Hollis's." Grin widened, but there was nothing friendly in it. "You've been out in the sun too long, Cutter. The girl was part of a deal, and you just tore up the contract." At that, a murmur rippled through the warriors. Deals with outsiders were dangerous enough, but taking a chief's child for any bargain was a stain no tribe could allow. Hollis's words had been chosen to divide the camp, and Ephraim could see they were working on some. Machia stepped forward, spear in hand, eyes flicking between Chatan and Hollis. His loyalty was clear, but his patience was thin. "Let us take them now," he growled, meaning Hollis and his men. But Chatan raised a hand, his eyes still locked on the rancher. "You rode armed into our home," the chief said, his voice steady as a drawn bow. "Leave or you will not ride out." The space between the two lines seemed to shrink with every heartbeat. Ephraim could feel Tayanita's breath quicken behind him, could almost hear her pulse. Hollis's hand drifted toward his rifle, slow but deliberate. Around him, His riders mirrored the movement. Across the way, warriors shifted their weight, fingers curling around bowstrings and triggers. Somewhere in the night, a coyote howled, and then silence fell, deep and heavy. The next sound would be the one that broke it. The silence cracked like glass. No one would later agree on who fired first, but the muzzle flash lit the night for a heartbeat, and then the desert roared to life. Rifles barked, arrows hissed, and the smell of gunpowder bled into the air. Horses reared and screamed. Hollis's men spurred forward, their shots tearing through the wall of warriors. The camp became a storm of dust and fire. Ephraim shoved Tayanita toward Nokomis, shouting for her to keep the girl behind the council stones. He drew his Colt and stepped into the chaos. A rider charged at him, shotgun raised, but Ephraim dropped to one knee, firing twice. The man tumbled from his saddle, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the dirt. The noise was deafening, every shot, every shout bouncing off the maces like war drums. By the time the column reached the maces, the sun was low, throwing long spears of shadow across the desert floor. The riders fanned out as they approached a cluster of hide lodges and smoke plumes, their movements so fluid it felt like a single organism breathing. Ephraim Cutter had been near native camps before, but never at the heart of one, never as an outsider who had carried the chief's daughter into his arms. Every step his horse took seemed to draw more eyes toward him. Children peeked from behind lodge flaps, their faces painted for the evening rites. Women with beadwork dresses paused in their tasks to stare, their gazes cold but curious. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and boiling meat, undercut by something sharper suspicion. Ephraim kept his back straight, his hand resting on Tayanita's small shoulder. She sat rigid in front of him, not speaking, not looking at anyone. It was as if she'd folded herself inward, shutting out the world. Makia rode past, shooting Ephraim a glance that was more challenge than warning. The younger warrior's horse kicked up dust in deliberate arcs, marking his passage like a claim. Behind him, older men with weathered faces dismounted, their eyes scanning Ephraim as if weighing his worth in hides or bullets. He recognized the look. It was the same one soldiers gave before deciding whether to pull a trigger. Chatan dismounted at the center of the camp, where a ring of large stones encircled the council fire. He spoke briefly to an elder woman, Nokomis. Ephraim guessed her hair silver, her eyes bright with the kind of knowledge a man couldn't buy or steal. She studied Tayanita for a long, heavy moment, then turned her gaze to Ephraim. "You walk in a place where truth is sharper than any knife," she said in careful English. "Be certain of the words you speak tonight." Ephraim felt the warning settle in his chest like a stone. Truth had never been a simple thing in his life. It was often bent, traded, or buried. But here, among the firelight and the steady beat of the drums returning in the distance, he knew there would be no room for half measures. Tayanita's hand tightened on his arm, a silent plea he couldn't yet name Dot as the council fire roared to life. The warriors began to circle, their painted faces flickering in the shifting light. Somewhere in that ring of shadows, the truth waited ready to burn a hole through every secret the desert had tried to keep. The council fire cracked and spat, sending sparks spiraling into the cold night air. Around it sat the elders, each one wrapped in robes heavy with beads and stories. Chatan stood behind them, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Ephraim as if the fire itself were his eyes. The circle of warriors pressed in close, their shadows moving. Like restless spirits, Nokomis stepped forward first, her voice low but strong. "We are gathered because blood has been carried across the desert," she said in her own tongue before switching to English. "This man, Ephraim Cutter, brings back the daughter of our chief. But the child's silence tells more than his words can." Every head turned toward Tayanita, who stood near Ephraim, her eyes locked on the flames. She didn't speak, didn't blink. The girl looked as though she were waiting for permission from someone or something to open her mouth. Makia broke the silence with a scoff. "She doesn't speak because he took her," he said. His tone was sharp, but there was a satisfaction in his eyes, like he wanted the accusation to stick. Chatan didn't correct him. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than most men's shouts. Ephraim stepped forward, feeling every gaze pin him in place. "I found her half dead in the sands," he said, his voice steady though his pulse was climbing. "No water, no shade, no one around. I brought her here because it was the only way to keep her alive." He looked directly at Chatan. "If that was a mistake, then I'll answer for it. But don't tell me leaving her there would have been right." Nokomis's eyes narrowed. "And yet she fears her own father," she said. The words hung in the air like a hawk over prey. The fire popped loudly, drawing a few glances, but no one spoke. Chatan's face remained a mask, though something dark flickered deep in his eyes. Ephraim felt the weight of that flicker. There was a truth here, buried under years of silence and duty, and it was clawing to the surface. Then, without warning, Tayanita's small voice broke the night. "I didn't run away," she said, barely louder than the fire's hiss. The circle went still. She turned her head toward the elders, then to Ephraim. "I was taken." Her words cut through the camp like a blade. Ephraim's stomach dropped, and for the first time, Chatan's face cracked, not in anger, but in something colder. The moment Tayanita's words hit the night air, the circle erupted. Warriors spoke over one another, some in disbelief, others in anger. The firelight threw jagged shadows across painted faces, turning the camp into a storm of motion. Chatan didn't move, but the set of his jaw told Ephraim the words had struck harder than any arrow. Makia stepped forward, pointing a finger at Ephraim. "He put those words in her mouth." The young warrior's voice dripped with triumph, as though he had been waiting for this moment. But Tayanita shook her head, her voice trembling yet sure. It wasn't him. It was. She stopped, her gaze dropping to the dirt as if something in it held her there. Nokomis leaned forward, eyes narrowing, urging her silently to continue. Chatan's voice cut through the clamor. "Who?" It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of question no one could ignore. Tayanita's lips parted, yet the answer didn't come. Instead, her eyes darted toward a cluster of warriors on the far side of the fire. Ephraim followed her gaze and saw it just a flicker in the stance of one man. Shoulders too stiff, eyes locked on the flames instead of the girl. Abner Hollis. The name hit Ephraim like a hammer. Hollis wasn't one of them. He was a rancher whose land bordered the edge of tribal territory. A man who'd made his fortune on trades that never seemed to leave him short. That he was here at all was strange enough. The Tayanita looked at him with fear. That was something else entirely. Nokomis rose, her voice slicing through the confusion. "The council must speak alone," she declared. Several elders nodded, and slowly, the noise of the circle dimmed. Warriors pulled back, though many kept their hands near the grips of their weapons. Chatan's eyes never left Tayanita. Ephraim could see the war inside the man, the pull between the truth his daughter hinted at, and the unity of the warriors who would not forgive weakness. Chatan moved like a man half his age, his bow singing as arrow after arrow found its mark. Makia was a blur of motion, his spear flashing in the firelight. But Hollis was the eye of the storm, cutting through the chaos on a black stallion, searching for the girl. Twice Ephraim caught sight of him, and twice the man vanished into the smoke and dust, always closing the distance to where Tayanita hid. One of Hollis's men broke through the defensive ring, barreling toward the council stones. Ephraim sprinted after him, hard hammering, knowing he wouldn't reach him in time. But then a sharp cry rang out, The man's horse reared violently, an arrow buried in its flank. Tayanita stood just beyond, holding a small bow too large for her hands, her eyes blazing with something fierce and unafraid. For a moment, everything slowed, the girl's defiance, the shock on the attacker's face, Ephraim's rush of pride, and fear tangled into one. But then Hollis himself emerged from the smoke, rifle in hand, spurring his stallion straight for her. The warriors saw him too late. Ephraim fired, the shot grazing Hollis's arm but not stopping him. The rancher swung from his saddle, grabbing Tayanita and hauling her up in one brutal motion. Ephraim lunged forward, his boots digging deep into the sand. Hollis met his eyes, a grin of pure malice spreading across his blood-smeared face. "She's mine, Cutter," he spat. And then the stallion surged away into the dark, Tayanita's scream tearing through the chaos like a signal flare. Ephraim didn't wait for orders. He was already in the saddle, spurring his horse into the black horizon where Hollis had vanished. Behind him, hoofbeats thundered, Chatan, Machia, and a dozen warriors driving hard through the smoke of the dying battle. The desert night was cold against his face, but his blood burned hot. Every stride brought the hoofprints sharper in the moonlight. Every breath, the echo of Tayanita's scream. They crested a low ridge, and there he was, Hollis, galloping toward a narrow canyon, the girl struggling in his grip. Ephraim leaned forward, pushing his horse until the wind tore at his hat brim. Shots cracked from behind him. Machia's arrows, Chatan's rifle forcing Hollis to weave, slowing his charge. The canyon walls loomed closer, funneling them into a choke point. That would decide everything. Ephraim closed the gap. Hollis turned in the saddle, firing wildly. A bullet tore through Ephraim's sleeve, burning the skin beneath. He didn't slow. With a final kick, his horse lunged forward, closing them side by side. Ephraim reached out, grabbing Hollis's coat and yanking hard. The rancher lost his balance, and they crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury. The horses scattered, leaving only dust and moonlight. They fought like men who knew there was no tomorrow, fists, elbows, the taste of blood sharp in the air. Hollis swung wild, fueled by rage, but Ephraim fought with something stronger. The promise he'd made to himself the moment he found Tayanita in the sand. He caught Hollis's arm, twisting until the rifle clattered away, then drove him into the canyon wall. Hollis hit the ground hard, breath wheezing out. Ephraim stood over him, Colt aimed steady. Chatan rode in then, dismounting with the grace of a predator. He looked from Ephraim to Hollis, then to his daughter, who had scrambled to the safety of Nokomis and the warriors. "This man took my blood," Chatan said, his voice low but deadly. "In our law, that is death." His eyes found Ephraim's. "But tonight the choice is yours." The silence was heavy. Ephraim's finger tightened on the trigger, then eased. He holstered the Colt, stepping back. "He's not worth the bullet." Chatan gave a single nod. Machia stepped forward, binding Hollis's hands. The warriors led him away, his curses fading into the night. Ephraim knelt beside Tayanita, meeting her steady gaze. For the first time, she smiled small, but real. As the first light of dawn broke over the desert, the war drums were silent, and the burning sands felt, at last, like they could rest.